In the afternoon, you have seen from the program, we have 3 different topics which we want to cover. We will start with the session on timely completion of pediatric investigation plans. And I mean, you may wonder why this is an issue at all. Isn't it supposed that, or is the regulation not designed in a way that the pediatric investigation plan should be completed in time? Because you have, for example, the requirement that the application for a pediatric investigation plan has to be submitted very early. But the topic proves to be more complex than this, and it's not just the letter of the law which is decisive, it's also practical issues that have to be factored in. And in this session we would like to be a bit more specific on these practical issues that may influence the timely completion of a PIP. And for this issue, we have assembled again a panel of experts, which will start with giving us a bit of feedback regarding their experience and their impressions. And we have basically tailored the session around 2 main questions, which you will also see which you see on the screen. So, which elements have been experienced as obstacle to a timely completion of studies in an agreed pediatric development plan, and which measures could be basically taken to proactively address these issues. So we will first hear from our experts, so to say, and then open up the discussion to all of you, so that you also can contribute from your experience. And we will kick off with Mark Turner. You already heard his intervention, so I also expect some further action points after his talk. But let's start with your intervention.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a valuable opportunity that we're very grateful to the Commission and the agency for organising, so thank you for that. Enpr-EMA has nearly 50 members, and if I told you about all the obstacles they'd ever told me about, then we'd be here all day. So I've taken all the conversations I've had about the regulation over the past 10 years and put them into 2 obstacles, 2 solutions and 2 action points. The first obstacle is that paediatric investigation plans and the trials within them are not always based around validated data about patient availability or realistic estimates of availability. And many people complain that studies are not feasible, and this is a summary of that. So there are many different ways of looking at feasibility, and so to summarize all of those, the agency came up with this fantastic word, preparedness, which is a lovely European word, which we've used very carefully. And in order to address this, a European network of paediatric research at EMA working group led by Angeliki Siepka and Ruth Ladenstein has been working on this. They've been gathering best practice about feasibility and trial preparedness. They're in the process of seeking opinions to inform this from a number of stakeholders, and we're in the process of writing a points to consider document about trial preparedness, in the hopes that everyone will be able to contribute to this process before the PIPs are written, before the studies are written, so we can overcome some of the problems that have happened before and then come up with slightly more feasible studies. The next slide indicates some suggestions that have arisen in this discussion. Oh, I see. Oh, this. Wow, it's a bit smaller than usual. Okay. Cool. So the preliminary suggestions are to scope the clinical and regulatory context of the plan, to look at the therapeutic need in the way that we've been hearing about, consult sites and other sources, consult participants, and Begonya can tell us about this, and then look on the key influences on preparedness, for example, by what can go wrong between looking at epidemiology of a study and recruiting patients. and then consolidate this into a structured justification that the trial has been prepared adequately. And we're almost going to suggest something like an extrapolation concept, but for preparedness, a preparedness concept, an explicit statement of your assumptions, an explicit statement of where the data came from, which can then be discussed and modified as time goes by, so that people know how many studies there are, how many children there are, and the studies are designed around the children rather than around preconceptions. So this work is underway. There'll be a consultation about it in the next few months, and the action plan is quite detailed for this working group, and it includes completing this, I think, within about 6 months. So it'll be in the public domain and ready to go. So we have action plans for this already. The second obstacle is that sites are not ready for trials. Each trial reinvents the wheel, and then sites do not have the drivers or incentives to maintain readiness. So our solution is that networks will share best practice through site standards, through national coordination to adapt to each country's legal framework, through working with established specialty networks, and Gilles and others are good examples of that, and then to bring together education and training, and then consolidate the sites and the requests to develop economies of scale so that sites have consistent drivers' incentives to maintain their readiness, and we'll be developing a business case for sites and for networks to maintain this. And our action plan is embedded in our application to this call. IMI2 put out this call last year for a pan-European clinical trials network. Many people in the room contributed to an application, and if this application is funded, then we will set up a network, explore sustainability, bring together the expert groups in the ways that we've been talking about this morning, and so on. And Vicky and other people would contribute to data management if we're successful, and so forth. So I don't know how many action plans we have within this application, but there are many that we would hope to build into this. So the general action plan is that we hope everyone can support this work if it's funded, and join in similar initiatives to this so that we can build on our experiences. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these pertinent comments and this perspective from academia and healthcare professionals. We will now move on to a presentation from Heidrun Hildebrand on giving us a bit an insight on the industry perspective and what their perception is.
Yep, thank you, Florian, and thank you to everybody for having us and allowing us to give an industry perspective on this topic. And with this slide, I really only want to follow what Mark already said and illustrate that the challenges are really many and much too many to discuss them all here. So that illustrates that challenges related to the completion of a pediatric investigation plan and related studies are really multifaceted and really affecting all stakeholders. And all stages of the preparation and the conduct of clinical studies in that area. And with the following slides, we have tried to somehow carve out the areas where we would see the most, which have the most impact on that purpose and are the biggest obstacles, and also carve out some possible solutions to this. And let me start on the next slide, really with regard with the planning and the design phase here. So, and if we look in this, then many issues are really related to the lack of information. We have at the time. We prepare the PIP and we agree around the PIP, and that is not also related to safety or efficacy data from the adult development program, but it also includes information regarding parallel development activities in the same indication or in the same conditions. It goes to or the same classes of drugs, which could inform the scientific discussion around the right indication, scientifically sound endpoints, and the right patient population we can choose to make this a successful pediatric development plan. And all of these are needed to avoid multiple and time and resource consuming modifications and to rate whether a planned program is really viable or not. The proposal we would see is that we have the feeling we need to improve this process and the efficiency really by more and more timely scientific and regulatory discussion involving all stakeholders on a global level into this discussion and really to make this the generation of a PIP a more evolving process. So in the way we need to build and agree on a PIP in a more iterative way. We will come to this from a process perspective in more detail in the following session, which goes on the regulatory process here. A further point we have and a further obstacle is what goes hand in hand with the scientific discussion is really the need to better support and integrate innovative approaches into the studies. And this includes innovative study designs which may allow to reduce patient numbers while increasing even or the value of the study, or also the use of wearables or IT solutions to really bring the study to the patient and not the patient to the study. And but what we need to overcome the hesitation on both sides within industry and at the regulatory bodies to use these new tools is really more clear guidance on how to use them, how to implement them, and what to do with the data afterwards. And one way to foster this is our proposal would be, and that was mentioned this morning already, more multi-stakeholder workshops in going into this. And from my personal perspective, the activities around the generation of the extrapolation paper or the already cited PRH workshop are really ways to go to help to overcome these obstacles. And last but not least, when it comes to designing a PIP, we also have to admit that very often medical practice and standard of medical care are neglected in the studies, which then leads to really disruption of daily routines at the sites and the families and with the patients. And that is a very high hurdle for recruitment in our studies because mainly the sick children are affected anyway. And also here I think we have to think on more flexibility, how to really allow to be closer to the daily life of the patients in our protocols and not make them too strict. If we then move on to the elements we have seen as major obstacles during startup and conduct of the studies, and in preparation of this presentation, I looked also to some of our industry benchmarks, and I was quite. It was quite striking to see that in general, startup time of pediatric studies is anything between 6 to 8 months longer than the startup time of similar studies in adult patients, and. One of the drivers of this major differences is really the diversity of the regulations around clinical trials and specifically around pediatric clinical trials across the member states of the European Union. I think the Enpr-EMA spreadsheet on the requirements around consent and assent is a very nice and prominent example of this. And we clearly need better alignment and a more consistent implementation of the regulations around pediatric clinical trials, and also looking to the future more stringent implementation of the clinical trials directive in these countries. Another point here is the scattered and sometimes insufficient infrastructure we have for clinical trials in Europe, and I think Mark already mentioned this. And I think with what is on the one hand the success of the pediatric regulation is that we really see more and more clinical studies coming along with pediatrics, and that studies require more and more patients. Infrastructure hasn't kept up, and we have initiatives ongoing in Europe who hopefully will help to ease that pain. But we also of the opinion that is also something which can be not only done by networks, but we really also here need more action from single member states to really look into the clinical trial infrastructure in that way. Last but not least, I think we have an area which is a hurdle for recruitment in quite a number of countries, and that is the lack really of understanding or of knowledge and of acceptance of clinical research in children across society, so in the broader public. While for chronically ill children with cancer in oncology or with rare diseases, parents are normally very, very well informed and very well aware of the opportunities clinical research has for them, and willing to give their child into a study. In the moment you look to more acute illnesses, and I think the example of anti-infective trials was just mentioned this morning, then the picture is completely different, and you not even have 20% of parents really happy to give would allow their child into a study. To summarize, the measures we would propose is really looking to improve the way we generate PIPs, and we agree upon them in a more iterative way to allow that we can build the pediatric development plan more progressively with better scientific and regulatory dialogue, with a better understanding and the better utilization of the standard of care in the certain population and indication. We need to ensure that we build pediatric plans with then readily acceptable by national competent authorities and by the ethics committees. And the plans have to allow for a more rapidly adaptation to evolving new information and data. We have to foster, I think, and that comes with the initiation, the innovative approaches for study design and data collection, and to be able to do that, we need a clear guidance how to do that and what to do with them. Sufficient infrastructure and improvement of the infrastructure for pediatric clinical trials was mentioned before, and obviously better education of society as a whole of the benefits of pediatric research and the measures we have in place to ensure the safety of the participant during the trial. Thank you.
Thank you very much. To complement the picture, we are now moving on to the patient's perspective, and Begonya, Nafria, Escalera from Spain will give us some insight on experience they have built up in Spain, Barcelona, on also involving young patients in advising, designing, helping clinical trials and facilitating clinical research.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm here on behalf of the young people, and specifically on behalf of the European Young Persons Advisory Group Network, that it's a network that has the recognition of Enpr-EMA. We had identified three main obstacles. The first one are methodological aspects. Basically, we consider that sometimes the protocols of the trials are not adapted to the needs and the features of the children. Sometimes it's a small version of the adult trials. The other one is that sometimes the inclusion and exclusion criteria of these trials are non-feasible. We have the problem sometimes to find patients for these trials because we don't have any patient that can fulfill these criteria. And the third one, from the methodological aspects that we have to face, is that sometimes these trials are not centered in the patient. So sometimes we say that the patient needs to adapt to the trial instead of the opposite. For us, it's very important to include in the design of the trial aspects about the quality of life of the patient and also of the family, because all the family are participating in the trial. Another important feature from the methodological aspects is the control of the label use prescriptions, because we know that they are working at this moment. We also encourage to use validated tools and suitable outcomes accordingly with the age of the patient. We encourage to use only placebo when it's needed and when we don't have an appropriate active control. And the last one is to use appropriate design for small samples of patients, because sometimes we have big difficulties to recruit patients. From the point of view of the ethical aspects, for us it's very important the process to assess the benefit risk and to find the balance. Sometimes we have to perform medical procedures that are very invasive for the children, because, as I said, we receive protocols that include the same medical procedures of the adults with the children. One example sometimes it's the volume of blood that we need to obtain for the children. We can obtain the same quantity from adults in children. The other point is that we need to consider the prevention and the reversibility of the side effects of these trials. And the last point that I want to emphasize here is to take into account what happens if we have to stop this treatment with children. Regarding the regulatory aspects, for us it's very important the harmonization among the European countries about local regulation, about the processes of patient information regarding the consent and assent process, because at this moment the age to participate in the trial and to sign the assent document, it's not harmonized around Europe, and this is one thing that we have to face. And the other thing is the ethics committee's approval. Sometimes in the same country, for the same trial, 2 or 3 different ethics committees don't have the same assess, and the same trial needs not approved in this amount of ethics committee. And the other point that I want to focus here about the regulatory aspects is that we consider that it's important to involve the patients along all the life cycle of medicines. Of course, it's important for the trial, for the design, but also it's important for the patients, and we need to measure and to balance the benefits that means about the ROI, the return on investment, and about the ROI, the return on engagement, because this is part also of the adherence to the treatment. And regarding the measures that we propose to face these obstacles, here there is the list. The first point is to design pediatric clinical trials considering the features of the patients, considering that the real world of pediatrics is very different from the real world of the adult patients. The other point is that patients' participation in the early phases of clinical trials, we consider that has very important benefits. We can include patients to define research priorities. We can include patients to review and improve the protocol design. And we consider that in the most complex studies, the positive point would be to request as a mandatory the participation of the patients. We save time, we save resources, and we can design and perform clinical trials that can fit with the needs of the patients. Another point that we want to focus, for us it's important to promote the standardization of the young patient involvement along all this process. And we are starting to work with the European Medicines Agency in this direction at this moment. But the idea, as I mentioned in the next point, is to work with all the stakeholders. It means work with the sponsors of the studies. It means work with the ethics committees. And for all this process, for us, it's very important the education and the training addressed to the patients. And in this training process, we need to involve also the researchers, the sponsor, and all the stakeholders. It's not enough that we can have experts and trained patients. We need to explain and train the whole community that is behind of the clinical trials in the meaning of patient engagement. Thank you very much.
First, thank you very much. This is now complemented, the patient's perspective from the side of Elizabeth Vroom, who is here for the World Duchenne Organization.
First of all, thank you for having the opportunity to speak today. World Duchenne Organization is involved for a while already in clinical trials, also with EMA and FDA. And what is important to know is that we had the multi-stakeholder meetings already for Duchenne, speaking about clinical trials. However, on the questions asked today, we still see difficulties to get trials really into place in Europe. And one of the problems, one of the problems is the different interpretation of the pediatric regulation by the national ethics bodies. And we already have discussed that when the pediatric regulation came in place, because it says it is really giving room to this. For example, it says that the burden of the trial should not be more in a certain phase than the burden of the standard treatment. Well, if you have a rare disease, it's very likely there is no standard treatment. So then some countries say, but of course, then you compare it to the burden of the disease. But that's not in the regulation. So it's open to the countries how they interpret this. There is a need for consensus and for guidelines, but I think there's also a need to really register which national ethic bodies are much stricter than others, because they are very often not aware themselves that they turn down more clinical trials based on a PIP than other countries. So I think some awareness there is important, but also consensus and guidelines, a little bit in line with what Begonya said about harmonization. The other problem is about recruitment. And the recruitment is because a lot of trials are not designed, and again, a little bit in line with what Begonya said, are not designed according to what is feasible for patients and also what is doable for the society. We might have, for example, patient preferences, if they would be included in the pediatric investigation plan. One of the questions in Duchenne muscular dystrophy is very often the place of biopsies. And we have gone back to all families. We really traced them all in the Netherlands, but also some other countries whose children have been in clinical trials, including a biopsy. And what parents say is, we think a biopsy is acceptable when it is about proof of principle. So the phase 2, a biopsy, we understand. We don't like it, but we understand and we would say yes. However, in the phase 3, where in Europe, under EMA, a drug won't be approved on a biomarker, unless it's a surrogate endpoint, but on the biomarker, but on the functional outcome, then why would we have our children go through a placebo group and having this burden of 2 or 3, or some kids, 5 biopsies? Well, the muscles are your gold. So this kind of discussion you should have when designing a trial, and not afterwards having patients say, we won't participate. Okay. The other big problem, I think, in trial design is also, and it's mentioned before today, is the data. And I think we speak now for 10 years, 15 years, you all know about sharing data, and it's just not happening. Why is it not happening? Probably to children you say if you want them to change their behavior, there's incentives of punishment. And probably that's the same with data sharing. There should be incentives to do. And what we don't do enough, I think, as patient organizations is to make clear that the data are owned by the patients. So patients can say to academics, to companies, use it or lose it. Patients can pull it back or can ask to download or get their own data and upload it in a registry, which is a central database, because we still don't have central patient registries or disease registries. There's a lot in silo, and the silos are there for a long time. And I think EMA could play a wonderful role in pulling down the silos and integrating data more than has been doing today. But I also think that patients should be more clear about their position. It's their data, or they are the data, whatever you want to say. So things should really move in that direction. Now with the upcoming GDPR, it is obligatory that the data the portability of data is obligatory. So a patient can ask back their own data, and also can remove their own data. And I think indeed there is a general lack of awareness on the benefits of clinical trials. We need better clinical trials, and I think parents get more and more aware that they don't want their children to participate in suboptimal trials. And with suboptimal trials, we mean trials which at the end won't give the answer. So we feel that if we would, as patients, be more involved in the trial design, how we could really make sure that trials would be developed in a better way. However, we see for example, here in EMA, that there are a lot of different committees. In some patients are represented, and others not. There might be patient representatives, but not disease-specific patient input. And is it really needed to have all these, the CAD and the PEDCO and the CHMP and all these different committees? Does that really help to have the best trial design? And is it also fast enough? So our question is, could this be optimized? And then there's another thing, that patient representatives in the EMA have a harder time than other experts, as we don't have a backup. We can't, so that means that you don't have an alternate way you can discuss it with if you're a disease-specific participant. So we would really feel that it would be good to have the possibility to go back to at least one or two people in the same disease area to discuss what's on the table and to have their input as well, because only having the opinion of one person is quite difficult. So having said that, one of the things we also have been discussing recently is maybe we need master protocols to be more involved in drug design, because we now have a lot of different trials going on, and the placebo data are all different because they're done in a different way. So we really would like to see how we can optimize trial design in order to improve clinical trials in Europe. Thank you. One thing, I forgot one thing. One in trial design is that that's not in Duchenne, that's not specific rare disease, but what we hear in the field, there's a lot of problems from parents that children who are in a trial for too long on a too low doses. And I think Professor Goemans is here in the audience. She might be one to explain a little bit more. But there are too many trials where the children are on a too low dose to be effective for too long. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before, we already now have a lot of food for thought, but before giving the floor to you, we will basically conclude this introductory session with perspective from the clinical trial application side. And we have with us Anne-Marie Janson-Lang, who will share with us her thoughts on this topic.
So, thank you very much for inviting me here, and I would like to contribute with a clinical trial application perspective, which I think actually has been addressed also by earlier speakers. So my background, I'm a physician working at the Medical Products Agency as expert and clinical assessor, and I'm also the co-chair of the Clinical Trial Facilitation Group, CTFG, and this is a working group under heads of medicines agencies. So what if we start to have a background on clinical trial numbers? Well, you will get different numbers of the same database depending how you ask the question. Here, I have made a search yesterday on the number of clinical trial applications where the sponsor reports that they involve minors as subject, And as you know, multinational clinical trials take place in more than one country. So, of course, we have removed the duplicates here because we are just interested in a figure of the number of clinical trials where minors are included. So it could be that minors are not included in all the member states, but this is an overall figure. And the year this is reported, this is actually when the data was generated in EudraCT. And we know there have been some flaws when the clinical trials have been uploaded to the database. So if you see some differences here with other figures, please understand that here we try to explain what we used as the basis, the year reported when the data was generated, and it depends on when actually you upload the trials. What we see in EU is fewer trials than when we started the period. So in 2004, really, we have seen a decline throughout the years. And we have also seen a decline in the number of clinical trials where minors are involved. But if you look at the general figure, it seems that if you look at 2017, a robust figure is around 10%, a little more, around 12% of the trials involve minor subjects. Please also note that we have differences in calculation, and it all depends on, of course, the data that are put into the database here. If you look at the number of trials with children, they are in the amount of hundreds, whereas the number of trials in EU totally is in the number of thousands. So then you will understand about the volume in EU total. So the first question is, when is the timely application of a PIP during a development program? When is that relating to the clinical trial application? And here, this arrow is a quite traditional figure of development of a new medicinal product. It is sometimes understood that the PIP should come in the time of the early clinical trials. Could it be at the end of the phase 2? There are different contributions on this. I will not add to that. But of course, we need to address what if you have a complex clinical trial design that is not structured in traditional separate phases. I think the earlier speakers talked about that also. So this is something that interests CTFG very much, and we are arranging a workshop on complex clinical trial design in Rome this Thursday. So I'm leaving you quite soon now to go for that meeting. But we need to be open, of course, to flexibility and to adaptivity. When it comes to how clinical trial applications interplay with PIPs, I think we should look perhaps at the two different things. PIP is one thing, and the clinical trial application, the CTA, is something different. So they have different scope, decision, opinion, and responsibility, different applicants, and there may be even a possible contradiction between a PIP and the clinical trial application. So the scope, of course, for the PIP is development program for an IMP. And when it comes to the clinical trial application, each clinical trial application should have the scientific grounds. You should generate robust data and the ethical basis to respect the integrity, rights, safety, and dignity of the subjects. So I think the two things are not identical. When it comes to who makes the decision, the decision on the PIP is really a centralized decision, you can say, in EU. It is done in the Paediatric committee, in an EMA committee, whereas the clinical trial applications, you have a decentralized decision, opinion, responsibility for these applications. So it's really the national competent authorities, clinical trial units, and the ethics committees that are making these decisions. So you do have some different aspects when it also comes to responsibility and decisions. The applicant is, of course, the market authorization applicant, for the PIP, which can change during the progress, of course. It can be very complex. But when you come to the clinical trial application, it's the sponsor of the clinical trial application that is making the application. It could be a commercial company, for example, the future MAA applicant, but it could also be a non-commercial group of researchers, for example, looking at the new pediatric use for already marketed products. So we do have different players actually when it comes to who does the application also. And there is no difference in the legislation on clinical trials whether they are commercial or non-commercial. So do the PIP and the CTA contradict each other? Well, of course, the application time is different. So if I go into no other aspects here, and if you look today in the legislation, there is no formal correlation between the PIP and the clinical trial acts in each member state. But if you look at the future, when we will have a clinical trial regulation, it will be the same regulation in the entire EU. There will then be one single decision per member state. And that will be a decision both from the competent authority and from the ethics committee. So they will come together in a single decision. And also, it is said in Article 6 of this clinical trial regulation that we should take the opinion of PDCO on PIP into consideration. This little piece of legislation was not there earlier. The new regulation will apply in a few years to come, and I think Fergus Sweeney will come and talk to you about this later today. So how can we improve things then? Well, we as CTFG, we represent our members. They are the clinical trial units in the different competent authorities. And we also have from some countries, it's the ethics committee that is also a member. So it's really a bit different from country to country. But we are open now for increasing contacts between assessors, between those in PDCO and between the NCAs and the ethics committees. We think that would be a very important step. And as I already said, there will be a future single decision on national competent authority and ethics committee per member state on clinical trials. And the date when the portal and database is ready, now built by EMA, that will be the date when it will be decided when the regulation applies. So there is a timetable to that. There will be transparency of both documents, protocols, assessment reports, and a lot of interesting issues here where you do not have the same level of transparency today. So CTFG, this working group of clinical trial units, is open to exchange really discussions on pediatric trials and to see how can we have a basis for important problems that are valid in pediatric trials. And we think that this will be a constructive way to prepare for the regulation when it applies a few years from now. And more specifically, we are planning an EU training workshop of pediatric clinical trial assessors to involve both competent authorities and ethics committees to exchange ideas on, it could be on design, it could be on ethical aspects of pediatric clinical trials, and to reach harmonization. Because we think that it's important that the assessors also come together. And as you have already mentioned now, there is a big variability between ethics committees in different countries. There are different units dealing with clinical trials and with PIPs. So let's try to overcome this, and let's try to exchange ideas more readily. And I'm really hoping that this will be for the better, for more medicines for children and for minors in our region. So the future is next exit. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to all the presenters for this great introduction. I will now open the floor to you and basically ask you to either comment on the presentations you heard or give your own take on the two questions we have put in the program, what your experience is with the timely completions and how obstacles could be addressed. I see already first...
Yes, thank you. My name is Jörg Hasford. I'm from Germany. I'm the chairperson of the Association of Research Ethics Committees in Germany, but today I represent the European Network of Research Ethics Committees. It was good that also the role of ethics committees was addressed in these issues. Let me say a couple of words on that. I think we have to realize, as far as I know, that the pediatric research is regulated by law in many European member states, and these regulations are very, very different. For example, it was already addressed, is assent or consent required? Has it to be respected or only observed? At what age? And all these issues, but also, just to give one example, in Germany, placebo-controlled trials are not permitted with minors. So it's not the ethics committee, it's a law that requires that. And the ethics committees are bound to law. And I think we should be very careful to, let's say the ethics committees do it differently, when in fact it's a law. And with the European clinical trials regulation, this will change. But it's not our fault that it gets delayed and delayed and delayed, and nobody knows exactly when it will come into or enter into force. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I wondered if when members or people say here, yeah, there are even differences between the ethics committees in one member state. I thought that in all European member states there are single opinion ethics committees. No. Okay, that, for example, is something that's, again, different in Germany. We have a single opinion ethics committee, so only one ethics committee comments on the trial protocol. I think that could be all, again, this is something that has to be done by the lawmakers, I think, and not on the individual ethics committees. Typically, the work of the ethics committee is also regulated by national law, and then these have to be addressed. And I also think, I can speak here only for my country, we assess every year exactly the number where the ethics committee have issued a definite rejection of the application. This is, again, according to our figures, the extreme exception. This is in the range of 2%, and often it's insufficient data and insufficient application. So that means 98% of all applications are passed. And I think among the 2% that are definitely rejected, I doubt that there's any trial according to the PIP or the Paediatric Committee trial application. So on the other side, 95% of the applications pass only with modifications. But these are typically negotiated with the sponsors. And I have also, as I take this pediatric research very, very considered very, very important, I also contacted the German pharmaceutical manufacturers organizations for the research doing industry, the VFR, and they said they have no problems with the ethics committees with regard to pediatric clinical trials. But I'm very much in favor of an increased exchange, but I can only speak for in this detail for my country, but I think most of the issues are beyond the reach of the individual ethics committees. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, obviously, the objective of this discussion is not to point fingers or to blame anything, but to get an exchange of views where we can do things better and where we can improve the situation. And there, I think we already benefit from you being here and also contributing to the discussion. And let's see what others. There I see a finger in the back of the room. And then Paolo Rossi. Yeah.
I'm Catherine Cornu. I'm working in Lyon, France. I'm a physician in clinical trials. And I think I want to speak about academic researchers' role in clinical trials. We have a role to play to develop innovative methods such as modeling, simulation, clinical trial simulation to find the best possible design to perform clinical trials quickly. And one thing that would help is to have a systematic line in the calls for funding academic research. We are applying and making proposals to obtain funding for research, fundamental research or clinical trial. For example, in H2020 or in the national calls. And if we could push for having a systematic line for pediatric research in the calls, then that would help a lot, because when you are competing with proposals in cardiovascular disease or very frequent cancer, then the pediatric proposals have very little chance to be funded. So this could be a recommendation we could make, to have a systematic budget line for pediatric research in all the academic calls. I'm not sure if I'm clear.
No, it was very clear. Thank you. Then I had Paolo Rossi.
Yeah, I think this section has been very, very interesting. And I believe that many have addressed the points that were, in a way, out of focus before. One point was the education. I think it's very important to have education, because if the people that are performing the clinical trials are not well educated to do this job, then we will have very bad results. But most of all, if the population is not aware of the importance of this of the clinical trials. In Italy, for example, in my country, there is a strong movement against clinical trials in children, so especially in vaccination. So we have to make them aware that this is an important thing to do. And then the second point, many of the speakers have been pointing out this aspect. And the second point was the disalignment between the PIP and the clinical trial application. I think this is also an essential point that has been discussed in this session. And I think that it's essential that the people that taking the decision at the national level are either the same or are very much in contact with the one that make the decision here. Otherwise, there will be always a disalignment between the decision of the PDCO and the decision of the national authority, because there will be a different opinion among these two bodies. And the third fact is the ethics committee. I think this is an essential topic. There are some countries, like my countries, where there are numbers of ethics committees. We have, before we had hundreds. Now we have maybe, I don't know, I don't remember, but kind of 70 or 60. So this means that this alliance is an essential point, not only because the ethics committees are bound to the law, of the national law, but because there is disagreement between ethics committees. So I think these are three aspects that if we don't take into consideration these three major aspects, then all what we have been discussing before will be jeopardized by these three relevant obstacles in performing clinical trials. So I think that the group should kind of address this as a group, and make statements how to handle these three different issues. So this is, in a way, is, I don't know, the sixth, seventh action point.
An immediate response from the panel?
Yes, we do have different laws today when it comes for the role of ethics committees for competent authorities. But please, just as Jörg said here from Germany, all these national laws on clinical trials will now disappear, and there will be one common regulation on clinical trials, including a chapter on informed consent and how this should be assessed and so on. So this is quite a big change. So I just wanted to stress this again, because the national laws today on ethics committee, of course, they will still exist, but they will not be applied when it comes to clinical trials on medicinal products.
Thank you. Liz Royce from lead nurse at the Evelina Children's Hospital in London. So I can only comment for the UK. But just a couple of points in terms of patient advisory groups. I think they're great. But I think that clinicians should be empowered to actually conduct focus groups, because patient advisory groups are not always possible in terms of funding, or especially when you are dealing with hard-to-reach groups such as patients with HIV or rare diseases. Actually, focus groups can be very useful in terms of feasibility and ensuring that the trials can go ahead. The other thing that I would just want to comment on is that in terms of education and training, yes, patient needs to be trained. I teach a lot in schools here in London, and also teach at university in nursing. All I can say actually is that a lot of nurses are the ones that actually are delivering those trials. So from a shall we say, a good clinical practice, the principal investigators have the responsibility of the trial, but actually the people who are on the ground floor delivering and making sure that those patients get access to those trials are the nurses or the pharmacists or people from the multidisciplinary healthcare team. So I think it's quite important that they are considered in terms of education as to how, from a bigger point of view and bigger plan, we actually disseminate those kind of worries that we have about, education and making sure that they are part of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Then we had in the background.
Yes, thank you. Sybil from the NSM. What I could encourage is that the applicant could submit earlier a PIP, because definitely this is helping a lot for clinical trial approvals. And what was observed very often is a incomplete submission of PIPs with only the last modification, or not the last modification but previous, or on hold the PIP. So that was put in a lot of question for clinical trials authorizations. Another point I want to highlight is that innovative research could help also for other areas like multiple sclerosis, and that this kind of link between fundamental and applicative clinical trial to help to define what is the limited number of patients that could be acceptable regarding considering the feasibility could be discussed, and the regulators are quite open in this, in particular in pediatric fields. Could be an important opportunity to also discuss with not only European FDA has seen also quite open. I cannot. I just have a few examples about that. To consider innovative approaches in pediatric for also adult development. So every piece of that could help for accelerating the development, and early submission is important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We had a comment first from Mark and then from...
Okay, so thank you. I just wanted to perhaps draw some lessons from the conversation so far, building particularly on Paolo's comments about potential action points that could harvest the conversation. The first one was to take a step outside the regulatory framework and try and lobby people in each country, policymakers and legislators, about the framework for research ethics committees. I think we're very grateful for the point that we can't focus on ethics committees. They sit in a context, and each context is different. But I think it's worth thinking, how can we be consistent about what we're asking for? And that would involve this sort of group coming up with some agenda for lobbying and discussion, so that every country gets the same message from the experts. So that action point would be to work towards consistency of ethics approvals, and maybe scope out what that consistent approach would be within 6 months, and then have an action plan within 12 months, and then start developing that and implementing it. And that's not, strictly speaking, within the remit of the agency or the Commission, but I think those players need to be part of that conversation so that everybody in each country can benefit from that. So that was one action point I hope builds upon the comments people have made. The second action point relates to the need to work with national competent authorities, and I wonder whether we need to have a conversation about trial preparedness after the PIP has been approved. I mentioned that we need to talk about how to design the PIP by listening to all the stakeholders so the PIP is feasible. But once it's been agreed, then there's another part of feasibility, which is actually putting all these pieces in a row. And we've heard very nicely why that can be a challenge. So I wonder whether there's a post-PIP piece of work that we could do with CTFG, with national competent authorities, with national clinical research networks and sponsors, to come up with a roadmap that will facilitate that, and when it is possible to align things, start to align things. But if it's not possible to align things, then at least signpost people towards better ways of working. So that, again, that would be scoped within 12 months and have an action plan within 12 months. And for me, it's really exciting to hear that the CTFG is working in this area now, because I think that'll bring an enormous value. The third action point would be to take Heidrun's suggestion of an iterative PIP, and this is within the scope of the Commission and the agency, I think. And maybe that's worth having a scoping exercise and then a proposal to actually how to do that, if people think it's worth doing. And whether that involves modifying the Commission's guidance about PIP applications, I don't know, but maybe it's worth thinking about the scope and then thinking about how to actually do it within 12 months, and then doing it with some pilots within 24 months. Again, just a suggestion.
Thank you very much. Begonya.
Yeah, thank you. Only I want to highlight 2 comments. One is related to the education. I agree with you that the education needs to be a wide concept, not only, of course, for young patients, families. For us, it's very important to train the researchers, to train all the staff that are involved in the clinical trials delivery. It means that if we can work on it, we are going to deliver the suitable educational resources to train them. And the other point is about the sustainability of the Young Patients Advisory Group. Of course, we need resources to maintain these groups, to provide new activities to them and to cover the expenses, and hopefully in the upcoming months, this is also another action point of our network. We can include these expenses in the cost of the trials, because we can balance and measure the benefits to involve the young patients in the clinical trials, and hopefully we can include this in the economical plan of the studies to make sustainable every team and of course the network.
So there are 2 further contributions. The first on this side.
Thank you very much. Just from a paediatric oncology perspective, where a number of the challenges should theoretically be overcome, clearly I think there are 3, to want to reiterate, 3 major issues in delivering a PFP on time. with an enormous will to do this. And these are the feasibility, even though with patient groups and recruiting all patients are feasible. Secondly is actually integration of the PIP with the clinical trial design by international cooperative groups. And thirdly, the complexity of the PIP. And very much the iterative discussion which was held a few minutes ago, that's something we proposed and published with the agency 2 years ago of a life cycle approach. And that would overcome some of the complexities whereby rather than having to define the phase 3 study before any child has received the agent. So I think these are some issues. And in one sense, returning to this morning's discussion, the Paediatric Strategy Forum, I think, is one way where we can get establishment of the feasibility, we can coordinate with the international clinical experts and get patient buy-in. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then first here in the front, and then we go to the back again.
Let me make a comment also. I'm also a clinical trialist and do clinical trials, and I'm currently involved in a pediatric trial too. And what I want to say in this function is, till the clinical trial regulation enters into force, there will be probably a couple more years we have to wait. But what we could do now is to extend the voluntary harmonization procedure. And there are a couple of member states that use what is called VHP+, where the drug regulators and the ethics committees work together already now in assessing what is in the future called Part 1. So there will be just one assessment done together by the ethics committee and the drug authority. And this is, I think, extremely helpful. We in Germany do this VHP Plus since 2 or 3 years, but as far as I know, very few countries who collaborate in VHP have this VHP Plus, and that could be done by the CTFG, getting an extra incentive, and that the drug authorities approach the ethics committees on the member state level and say, wouldn't you be willing to do that now, in particular for the pediatric trials? And this is extremely helpful. And then you have many problems that have been mentioned here. You will not have any more with different opinion ethics committees and different opinions with regulators, and so that will all have an end. And in this particular experience I just had in the last 3 months, it worked very well. The problems start when you get back and have all these contracts with the study centers and then. But at least you have the approval much faster.
Just to add in one fact here, this VHP that you mentioned, that's about 20% of all multinational clinical trials that now go through this VHP. There are also VHP independent processes of harmonization. Those are called pilot projects in several countries, where the competent authority is then collaborating with the ethics committee. And to get an overview of this, you can look at the CTFG homepage, and we will publish an update on which countries are there.
Thank you for this additional input. We had somebody in the background.
Yes, thank you. My name is Brian Aylward. I'm the Irish delegate to the PDCO. One aspect that we haven't, one aspect that often concerns us at the PDCO is that once a drug has been authorized for adults, clinical trials in children from that point on would become quite much more difficult because patients may not be inclined to enter a clinical trial, but would rather have the medicine on an off-label basis. And it's more of an open question, but is there a role for national payers to look at their reimbursement rules to incentivize patients toward clinical trials and away from off-label use?
Interesting suggestion. Don't know whether we have payers in the room to be able. We don't. There was somebody here in the front who wanted to take the floor, or
just to highlight one point. Timely completion needs also timely approval and implementation. And I was surprised the issue of when and what deferral was not among the question today for the meeting. Because indeed, when a PIP is submitted a few months before filing in adults, and then deferral are granted, then the pediatric trial starts when the drug is available, and then the drug is provided off-label to the patient, and the difficulty to recruit patients in the trial is important. So my question is, how would you foresee changes in this situation highlighted in the reports, which are many PIPs are late and deferred?
Thank you. There was a further in the background.
Around there, yeah.
Just a suggestion. I am also a president of an ethics committee, and I think the heterogeneity is really a problem, and it could be useful that the PETCO prepare a short movie to explain to the members of the committee, the ethics committee, what the PIP is and what it means in terms of how many persons have looked at the proposal, that the patients are involved, that pediatricians are involved, to give some background on the security profile of the proposal.
It's not the summary yet. Okay.
No, not on the summary yet. I was trying to get back to Gilles' question about the deferral, how we deal with that on those quote late submissions. I agree this is a very delicate topic. We have to judge. What we do currently is we invite CHMP in this discussion. Okay, so we'll try to make a consensus with them when it comes to those situations. So that's as far as we can go.
I would suggest that I give first the floor to two other people in the audience, and then I will give basically all the panelists again a possibility to have a final word. Okay.
Just one quick comment about timely completion of PIPs. At least for what it concerns anti-infective agents. I think it's one element that I know there is some agreement with, but perhaps is not clear to industry as much as simultaneous enrollment of different age groups. And I think that is something that it's really a concrete step to accelerate completion of those plans. And we know that for some agents that's absolutely appropriate. There's no rules that prevent that to happen, and I think that's something that industry at times doesn't believe to be true, and tend to continue the historical approach, which is to design PIPs along age staggered approach studies.
Thank you. And
Hello, I'm Isabelle Recht from France, representing an association of pediatric liver disease. I was wondering if you need resources to investigate all those PIPs, and I know that in France, for example, there is only one person, and I was wondering which resource can be put on this, and if in USA the files are paid for pediatric, do the industry pay to have in the States to have an authorization for pediatric medicines, or is it free like here? No. Nobody knows.
I don't know whether we have an expert for that here. The thing is, I mean, what is free of charge in Europe is the PDCO process. The company still has to pay then for the assessment of the marketing authorization application. And the reason why it is free of charge is basically was a decision by the legislator to say it's an incentive, and it was also taken into account that there is a kind of obligation imposed on industry, and to facilitate that, it was decided that the work is not further complicated by asking fees. But certainly, I mean, this issue that national competent authorities are then sometimes put in a difficult situation how to finance their contribution to the work of the PDCO is something which has been flagged in the past. I think I would now like to conclude the discussion before giving the floor.
But just to answer your question, the clinical trial application is usually is not fee paying.
Sorry, the clinical trial application most often has a fee.
As a fee?
Yes, it has a separate fee and it has a separate legislation. So we are talking here about different groups involved in different aspects of trials, and I think we have to talk from mutual respect between these groups. How can we increase exchange between PDCO and those taking the decisions on the clinical trial, whether they are clinical trial units in the competent authorities, ethics committees, and so on. But it's really not the situation that one can say that now everyone, all member states need to make exactly the same decision. I mean, we still will have the clinical trial regulation saying that decisions are made by member states, not by a central structure in EU. So I think we need to work on this with mutual respect, listening to each other's perspective, rather than thinking that now we are going to do it in one fixed way. Because, of course, there are pediatric experts in ethics committees, there are pediatric experts in clinical trial units, there are pediatric experts here in PDCO. Let's exchange. I think that's the key for success. It's not that we have closed rooms, but let's exchange information with mutual respect. And in that way, I'm sure that it will benefit the children.
Thank you very much. In this way, you already completed the task. I wanted to ask you to basically give your take on the discussion, and I will now also allow the other speakers to basically summarize their take-home message, not so much focusing on the obstacles, but on the solutions, and perhaps also from industry perspective. I would like one thing to add or to ask. You mentioned the need for information sharing. There are also sometimes observed the need for information sharing between industry itself about, for example, failed pediatric trials, failed concepts, or things that have not succeeded, and then giving this information also to other companies. But feel free to basically summarize your take-home message from as you want.
When you start, then I think if we start with the transparency or this question for information, I think it goes directly in the discussion we had in session 1, where we were looking for the medical need. Where is it? And part of our medical need approach was also that we need to understand: is there a need for more research? Is there a need for more trials or for different trials? Is there a need for available, accessible medication? And that also helps us in industry to focus our PIP. So that is a discussion where we also sometimes need maybe a hint from the regulators, because you know how many PIPs you have in that area. You don't need to tell us which company it is, but it would be helpful to understand that there are already 9 others who have filed for the same condition, which obviously then may make us think if that is still the right area to go, or if we should go different on a different path with that compound. Very, very bluntly, that is, I think, one of it. The other comment I would like to make, we have to be careful. Timing of the PIP submission is not necessarily directly linked to timely completion of the studies. Because especially if we do the iteration of the PIP and we want to have a more scientific-based approach to designing the studies, we may file the PIP relatively early, but we need some iterations in between to take the latest data into account before we really can design a solid phase 3 study. So I think that is something we also have to take. Yes, very often, if I come only a day before submission for MIA filing, then obviously there is a direct link, but not if I talk phase 1, phase 2, where I'm going with my PIP. And I think the take-home message for me was I sensed a huge sense of common understanding of the obstacles across everybody here in the panel. It was for me really striking that there is not only one group who sees the diversity of decisions or the issues related to information and sharing and how to implement innovative methods. So I think that was for me quite a good start to really improve this. Thank you.
My main message to take home is that it's feasible, the involvement of children and young people along all the process of the development of a medicine. And we need to have on board all the stakeholders. We have the commitment to help you to approach us, to train and to explain what means patient engagement in pediatrics, but we need your commitment to help us in the activities that you have along this process to take into account the voice of the children, because we know that if we include in first person them, the benefits are for all the stakeholders, and basically in the first stage for the patients that at the end, all of us are working for them. Thank you.
Well, what I was a little bit worried when I heard patients can also go in focus groups. I really felt that the take-home message, not only for me but for everybody, should be that a focus group can never replace the real representation of the patient voice in committees, because you're part of the dialogue. And a focus group is very often a tick box, even if it's not intended to be only a tick box. But I think that's really an important thing, that patients are also physically part of the discussion. And also, I realize how important transparency is. I think probably there could be more transparency when it comes to what is when on the table and where. If you want to give input, or from young people or patients or other fields, if you don't know what is at a certain moment at the table, you can't give the appropriate input at the appropriate moment. So I think that would be my take-home message. Yeah.
One of the features of the European Union that I love deeply is its ability to deal with multi-level governance, which I think is the problem that we've been talking about. And with all the willingness and shared understanding and mutual respect that has been evident today, I'm sure that by following some good action points, then we can use that understanding of multi-level governance to solve these problems and move ahead very nicely in future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now Dirk again will...
Thanks, Florian. And I'm happy to share my summary here on the last 1.5 hours on the topic of the timely completion of pediatric investigation plans. By the time we'll have the 4 main topics I have identified from the discussion, I can start. Of course, I have to start with the preparing of a clinical trial in pediatrics. Here we had a number of suggestions from Enpr-EMA, the work on reflection of the best practice, how to be best prepared. The infrastructure, we heard that this is an ongoing issue for many years. We're looking forward to the PRN now coming in the future. But also the appropriate clinical trial design seems to be an aspect that can be looked at either from the science side, but also, of course, from the patient side, to be involved in the clinical trial design more deeply, to actually facilitate and make it more feasible for the participants in the clinical trial. The design objective, I was surprised that it was not so clear that the design objective is very well defined before we start developing a medicinal product. But of course, there I think coming later to the topics of the communication, maybe that we can work on where we would likely to see the objective defined in pediatrics. And finally, and it comes back later, the early dialogue. I assume it means the early dialogue with PDCO, for example, but it can be also with other scientific groups, of course. The second point here, the interaction communication. It seems that this, and this was also in the first round I summarized, it seems that this is a very, very important aspect of pediatric clinical trial and pediatric medicinal product development, that we are aware that there's a common responsibility also to share information and exchange information between the groups, between the scientists and the clinicians, between the clinicians and the regulators, and the scientists and the regulators, and of course also with the industries, not forgetting them, and of course not forgetting the patients who needs the feedback. A workshop was mentioned to do so. I'll come back to the point of the strategic forums we have mentioned this morning. I think we have to look into those for us, whether we can use them maybe not for each population subgroups or therapeutic areas. This will not work, I guess, from the workload, but I think we have to find a more strategic way to use those interchanges. The interactive PIP design or PIP discussion, I think it's very interesting, and I'm sure we need to look back into this, how we can also use this maybe in a sort of reflection in the PIP guideline. I'm sure we will find some points here to discuss to get this around to also improve the clinical trial development in pediatrics. We will all wait for the new scenarios with the clinical trial regulation. I'm looking very much forward to this, sitting beside the co-chair here. PDCO has had many attempts to go to the CTFG in the past. But as we heard, the multinational governance in this area was not so easy for PDCO because it's basically a national area. So, but hopefully this will improve. But we can start before we actually get the clinical trial regulation into force, I guess. So that should be possible before to start this discussion here. Then I have the point of innovative clinical trial design. This is very interesting. Of course, you know that we have started on the extrapolation framework. This was a sort of a push into that area, but it should not only go back to extrapolation, modeling, simulation, and what else you can do nowadays on the techniques. But I think we should also look into the clinical trial designs where the patient or the participant input is given. And here was a clear plea that we should involve patient advisory groups, young patient advisory groups in that regard to also look into the innovation. The consideration of the burden of a clinical trial is very important, and the consideration doesn't only go to the blood volume taken, the investigations done, and so on and so forth, but also the burden on the participant and the families in pediatrics, who are both involved, of course, in those clinical trials. So that's something I think we also look into all the new approaches we have with the methodology. We should also not forget this. The regulatory guidance was mentioned, so I understand from that for the drug development, like we have clinical guidance on different disease areas, that maybe we should be more specific on the framework where pediatric clinical trials should go and how they should be like. So that is actually quite interesting, and we may have to feed back that to our internal groups who are looking at those guidance documents. And here again, it was mentioned that the early dialogue was utmost important. For me, this is a very interesting topic, as we are trying from the beginning with scientific advice to do so. So as you know, you can either go to scientific advice first or to the PDCO, depends what you like more, to have a harmonized view on the development and the questions asked to those groups. So I think here maybe we have to look into whether we can elaborate more into the sharing of the information at whatever stage to both scientific groups. Finally, I have the promotion of clinical trials in pediatrics. I mentioned in the morning the education or the the knowledge about the clinical trial. I think here again we have a repetition that of the plea that the acceptance and awareness how important clinical trials and research in children are. So to say that it's not from me, but not to prevent patients, children from research, but prevent them through research. I think this is a very important topic. We still have to work on to educate not only patients and parents. I think they are, at least for the chronic disease, are very well educated. But in general, the public educate them on the need for clinical trial and clinical research in children, but also in healthcare professionals again. And I have a question mark here. Shall we not start with the students, going back to when they are actually all caught on education before they go into practice? So maybe that could be something we should sort of formulate more. And of course, we will look into this with the stakeholders in future. So that is my commentary on the sections we had. Thanks very much.